Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
It is hard enough to buy a home in this country. You need the money in a down payment. You need to qualify for the mortgage. You need to actually find a place you can afford in a neighborhood that works for you. And in many cases, you need to outbid a lot of others in order to secure that property. But at least, if you can do all of that, then you have a place to live. A house that you can make your home. Usually. But not always. Sometimes, someone's already living in that house, and even if you have every right to make them leave, they can refuse. And then the police won't make them. Today's story highlights what one woman has called her nightmare, but it's also a useful look at Ontario's Landlord-Tenant Board, which is tens of thousands of cases behind. The LTB is a system that is designed to defend the rights of tenants, and that is necessary. But it's also a system in which there are no exceptions for tenants acting in bad faith. And that means even cut and dried cases still require a full ruling, still have to get in that line. And wait, and wait. And if that house that you bought has to wait and wait until you can live in it, well, you better find somewhere else to go, because it's going to be a while. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Sebastian Braun is a reporter with the Hamilton Spectator who has been following the saga of one woman's nightmare. Hey, Sebastian.
Hey, Jordan. Thanks so much for having me on.
You are very welcome. Why don't you just start by telling us about the woman at the center of this story? Who is Aisha Asghar? What's her story?
So Aisha Asghar is a 36-year-old tech sector worker who was laid off along with thousands of others in that industry last February. It was a loss that shook her finances significantly. Her Mississauga home was on the verge of being foreclosed on. She had to sell, and she was forced to buy a townhome here in Hamilton. She described herself to me as someone who does things by the book, someone who works hard and pays taxes and really just wants to have a simple, comfortable life.
So tell me about the home she bought in Hamilton. Where is it? How much was it? What's it like? Because this is all going to become important in a minute.
It's a very modest 2-story townhome attached to about 4 or 5 other units. And it's in East Hamilton, which has long been one of the city's most lower income neighborhoods. But Aisha knew that going in. She, after losing her job, she had just enough savings and severance pay to close on the home, which was $325,000. And she referred to it as not ideal or perfect, but just something she needed as a stopgap at this point in time to rebuild her life and find a new job.
And so this all sounds fine, unfortunate, but she secured a home at least. And where does the problem come in here?
So the problem came in about a week before closing, which was June 6th, when Aisha and the seller's realtor went to the home for a final check kind of thing. And Aisha thought that the home was going to be empty. There were tenants there previously, at least 3 of them, but she had been informed and also received copies of the N12 eviction notices that had been issued by the past owner to those tenants on March 12th, which would give them more than 80 days to leave. Mm-hmm. She was also informed that those tenants had indicated to the past owners that they would comply with the order and not put up a fight. Clearly, it wasn't the case, because when Aisha and the seller's realtor went to the home about a week before closing, they get there, there's mounds of garbage outside, there's loud music, the tenants were on chairs. The seller's realtor tells Aisha, give me a second and let me go talk to him. And when he comes back, he tells her they're not leaving.
So why won't they leave? And do we know anything about them? What have they said?
We had went to the house and we spoke to one tenant, Kimberly Sheffield, and her position was pretty clear. She's not leaving, and it's within her rights to remain there. That's what she said. She denied receiving an N12 notice, alleged that Aisha just wants to renovate the home, bring in new tenants, And she said, quote, "I'm not going to leave just because she bought a house. I don't think somebody who buys a house can just kick people out onto the street." So they planted their flagpoles there, and they're ready to put up a fight.
So I guess this is the million-dollar question. Like, is that legal? Are they within their rights? I understand there are a lot of complicated rules around this situation. Can you try to walk us through that?
Ontario law permits landlords to evict a tenant on behalf of a buyer, so Aisha in this case, insofar as the latter or one of their family members intends to occupy the home, but the tenant doesn't have to leave, right? The tenant can push the matter to a tribunal hearing and essentially challenge the purchaser's ability to move into that unit. And the reason for an eviction appeal is often twofold. In some cases, although these are a little more rare now because of the heavy fines that landlords can face, it just comes down to bad faith. The tenant knows the buyer isn't actually moving in and intends to rent the property out. But in other more common cases, tenants will appeal because they can't find anything on the rental market in their budget. That same paralegal I mentioned had told me that he doesn't know anybody who can leave a property just after 60 days. It's very hard to do that. And especially here in Hamilton, where you would need an annual income of over $177,000 to just buy a home in the city.
So there is a purpose to this rule, right? That someone can't just buy a house and kick out the tenants to move someone else in, right? That's a rent eviction, it's called.
Of course, it's something that's become a problem across Ontario in recent years, and certain cities, including Hamilton, have enacted bylaws that are specific to rent eviction and protecting tenants' rights. Because you see this in certain neighborhoods here that have been gentrified, might be a word that some people would use, but these old homes being sold to developers and being flipped over, and meanwhile the previous tenants that were living inside of them, get pushed to the street and they're not able to afford anything on the market. So that rule is really important for keeping those tenants, in affordable places.
But in this case, Aisha's not planning to do that. She's clearly planning to move into the home herself. So why does this apply? Isn't all that moot?
It should be. But the problem is it can take months after an eviction notice is issued just to get a hearing, and longer if that hearing is delayed or the tenant files more appeals. So Aisha, even though the eviction notice to the tenants, she says, was issued to the past tenants on March 12th, that's a long time ago, but it took up until June 6th for her to be the new owner of their home and effectively become the landlord of these tenants. She would have to wait another 3 months in order for that hearing to be heard at the landlord and tenant board, where, there are massive backlogs and so many landlords and tenants just waited months for cases to be heard.
What is she doing right now? I guess the tenants are still in the home. She closed on it on June 6th, expecting to move in. So what happened?
So she has been living out of her car. It's been a really sad situation. She's been sleeping in her car on some nights. On other nights, she's been sleeping on any friend's couch she can find. But, when you're unemployed and you're looking for a job and you need to do job interviews, it's a little difficult to, take over somebody's house, use their shower and stuff. And, she doesn't want to impose herself too much on her friends.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, often she'll just sleep in her car and she'll go to coffee shops during the day when she's looking for work.
And so that's going to be the case, I guess, until the Landlord-Tenant Bureau hears this case.
Mm-hmm.
What's happening at the house right now? You mentioned there was garbage piled up in the front?
Mm-hmm. So when we had gone over to the house, there was piles of belongings, a random assortment of things, from bikes. There was an office chair, there was bed frames, a love seat. It's a very narrow front yard. The tenants are still there. Aisha has had to hire a property management company just to deal with the tenants because she said they've become so difficult and unreasonable. That same property management company conducted an inspection of the townhome. They found interior damages exceeding $17,000. There was photos showing graffiti scribbled on most of its walls. There was window screens missing, clutter and debris throughout. The tenants denied there being any damage in the home, but the photos certainly say otherwise.
So Aisha owns this house and there's all this garbage in the front and apparently damage to the home. Who's on the hook for that? When it goes to the landlord-tenant board, can they make the tenants pay for repairs? What happens to a property that's being used in this way?
I mean, it's possible they might order the tenants to pay for repairs if they find that the damages were committed by them. But even just a ruling, it doesn't necessarily mean that she's going to get her money back. These things take time. If the tenants can't pay, then, she kind of has her hands tied. If they don't have the money to pay for the damages, even with the order, then they're going to have to work out some sort of agreement with the LTB, some sort of a timeline to pay back.
June 6th was the closing date. This woman is living in her car. We're speaking in mid-July. When does this actually get resolved?
So just very recently, she had the eviction hearing expedited by a month. Now, instead of being held on August 27th, I believe it's July 29th or very, very late July. She was, of course, happy because it means that, she's going to have to wait 1 month instead of 2. But she was also cognizant of the fact that this all depends on how the hearing goes. She might get the decision right away, but then she'll still have to wait 30 to 60 days for the board to issue an order. Let's say it's an eviction order, and then for the sheriff to enforce that order, right? Just because somebody receives the eviction notice and the landlord and tenant board rules in favor of the eviction notice, the tenant, say for being physically removed from the home, could technically still stay there, right? Until the sheriff gets there and, orders them to get everything out and leave.
In the bigger picture, as you reported out this story and sort of talked through all the process involved, what's the bigger problem here?
From what I've been told from people who work in this field is that there's too much of a backlog at the landlord and tenant board, that these cases are taking far too long, both for landlords and for tenants. I did speak to somebody from Ontario Landlords Watch, the president, Kayla Andrade, and she said that the checks and balances in place at the landlord and tenant board become an issue when tenants, the people who those laws are meant to protect, begin abusing the system. She said that even though Aisha has a hearing coming up, tenants have many loopholes where they can stretch this process out for as long as they want. And like I mentioned earlier, it can take months after an eviction notice is issued just to get a hearing, and longer if that hearing is delayed or the tenant files more appeals. It's seen a lot of Ontario landlords leave local real estate altogether because there's just such a massive backlog of applications. Another paralegal told me that the LTB, the landlord and tenant board, just isn't doing their job quickly enough. And especially when it comes to cases like this woman, she has the ownership records for the home. She clearly wants to live in it. Otherwise, she wouldn't be sleeping in her car. I was told by Andrade, why are we holding the LTB down with applications that don't really need to be heard by an adjudicator, right? This is a pretty clear-cut case. There are a lot more important factors that need to be dealt with by the LTB, not something like this that's so clear.
That's exactly what I wanted to ask you about, which is there a better way to do this, right? Understanding that these protections exist for a reason, and there are cases when the LTB needs to thoroughly figure out what's going on. This isn't one of those. Is there a better way to fast track these kind of cases?
It's a great question. This paralegal I had mentioned earlier, he argued that most people wouldn't have a problem with the tenant-friendly policies of the board, like tenants having the right to appeal evictions. But that's if you had a hearing in 2 to 3 weeks, not 2 to 3 months. So the LTB, in a statement, they attributed hearing delays to the volume and the complexity of the cases. The LTB resolved roughly 83,000 cases in 2023, which is up 45% from the year prior. But its backlog is still very significant. They received a staggering 84,000 new applications filed last year, which ranks as the second highest number of applications the board has ever received since it was created. The board is making a number of changes to try and speed up the process. But in the meantime, people who are involved in disputes at the moment, they have no other recourse but to wait.
So who owns this problem and who could add more resources to fix it? Is this the province? Is this the landlord-tenant board itself that could hire more people or streamline the process? Like, who creates the policy and the budget here, I guess?
Well, the LTB is an Ontario tribunal, so it's all under the province. In terms of what they could do, I was told that they simply need to speed up the process, clear that backlog. Maybe that means designated cases like Aisha's that are very clear-cut as cases that need to be heard more swiftly, and maybe giving a designation to other cases that might need a longer hearing or a days-long trial or something like that. The LTB did tell me that they've adopted a slew of strategies to reduce its backlog. They've introduced new technology. They've hired far more staff and adjudicators, and that was a big problem of the backlog was the lack of staff and adjudicators. And the board says that urgent matter hearings are now being held within an average of 5 to 6 weeks compared to 8 weeks or more in early 2023. So there are changes, but they're slow changes.
Last question then. Since you mentioned the time frame for this, in Aisha's case, she gets a hearing on the 29th, then they've got to decide it, then they've got to issue the eviction notice, and the tenants, you're saying, could just ignore that until the cops show up? Like, what is she planning to do in the meantime? That is a long time to live out of your car and on couches.
It is. She told me it was a nightmare situation. She doesn't know what to do. She's kept meticulous records about this whole dispute, from voice messages from the tenants to all the different N12s issued, the ownership records. She is building a case so that she can get in that house as soon as possible. But she's also very aware that it could take longer than she expects or wants. I think for her, part of the troubling thing beyond just not being able to live in the house that she bought with her hard-earned money is the fact that, she's gone from a young homeowner to a homeless landlord overnight, and she never wanted to be a landlord. And I think it speaks to her character, the fact that, she has taken on this role as landlord, even though she's obviously very upset and doesn't want to do it. She, has done it and is doing it by the book. She's sending the tenants letters about things that need to be fixed in the home, introduction letters to the tenants. It's like I said, it's a nightmare situation for her. And all she wants to do is just be in her home.
So one more, actually, that just occurred to me quickly, because I'm thinking about my takeaways from this and what people listening might take away from it. And the first thing that occurs to me is, man, it must be so much harder to buy a home that comes with tenants in it with a plan to evict them, especially in this climate and with this backlog.
It certainly is, but there's not a lot of homes available at the prices that people want.
Right.
Aisha bought this home for $325,000, and she was looking into a small pool of what was available. And I think most other buyers are in similar positions. So if you find the home that you want and it seems right for you and it's at just the exact price, but there's tenants inside, you might take the risk and work out a deal with the sellers to make sure that those people get eviction notices and go from there. Obviously, though, she would have loved to know that there was the possibility for this sort of situation to unfold.
Sebastian, thank you so much for walking us through this. What a crazy situation.
Thanks for having me, Jordan.
Sebastian Braun, reporting for the Hamilton Spectator. That was the big story. If you have other big stories, or even small stories, that you think we should know about, you can send us feedback. The way to do that is emailing hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca, or of course calling us and leaving a voicemail at 416-935-5935. If you want to go deep in the Big Story archives, you can do that at thebigstorypodcast.ca, and if you scroll all the way to the bottom, there is a little bar that will let you search by topic or by guest or by keyword or whatever you like. It's a good way to go down a rabbit hole if you're looking to binge. The Big Story is also available in every single podcast player, and it's on your smart speaker. Just ask it to play the Big Story podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.